Thanks so much, Corey. That was very kind. Gee, Toto, I think we must be back in Kansas. Woof. Not only Kansas, but Lindsborg, which in a 1925 newspaper article claimed to be the most intellectual town in the United States. That's true, the Chicago Evening Post. And I'm not sure I can live up to that by any means, but I have one credential for speaking to you about the woman that became Helen West Heller, and that is that she and I were raised about 8 blocks apart in the little town of Canton, Illinois. If these raisings hadn't occurred some decades apart, of course I wouldn't be here telling you about her today, for she was born in 1872, Helen S. Barnhart, and passed away in 1955. Now in 1948, she was elected to the National Academy of Design, sorry. And a requirement for admission was the submission of a self-portrait. By that time, she was quite a genius at incorporating a lot of information in a small space. So she gave them not only a self-portrait, but a sketch of the high points of her life. Here's a young farm girl, barefoot. Her family had about a 10-acre orchard. There's a fruit tree. And she wrote that she grew up in a house that was 2-story, so I'm sure that's a facsimile of her home. In her life, she undertook quite a number of migrations. So the waterfowl are very symbolic of that. And the fact that she came upon her particular niche in art came in the autumn of her life is represented by the falling leaves. Here's the self-portrait part at that time. And this is not a rustic sort of telephone, it's a piece of wood. And she's cherishing it because that really was her artistic life. Although to the end of her days, she considered herself primarily a painter. Success pointed in a different direction. This is not her way of saying, I'm number one. If you study the hand and the fingers, I think this is a gesture of defiance. And here is the activist Helen. Down with monopoly, this probably says. And in an obituary given her by the communist magazine Masses and Mainstream, it remembered fondly all of her participations in their May Day parades in New York City. And since today is May Day, I figure this is a very auspicious time to mention her. So the young girl from early times had a considerable ambition for some sort of career in the arts. And consequently in 1893, along with thousands of other young women, she migrated for the first time to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition of Art, where she hoped to derive for herself some sort of career. She discovered that the city of big shoulders was a city of cold shoulders. She had no success. She attempted to work her way through college. That failed. She couldn't find work, wrote often of leading a starving life in those days, and decided maybe she could get some proximity to that world by working as a model. Well, she wasn't a particularly handsome woman. As you see, here she is at age 58, working on a woodcut, but she failed all around in Chicago at the first trial. Now, I asked myself if I were 180 miles from home, no resources, and not doing well at all, I probably would tuck my tail and go back there. Well, Helen was a little engine that could. So what she did instead was set her sights even higher. She decided she would go to New York City. Exactly when she did that is not known. Here's her earliest published piece of art, which appeared in the literary magazine Criterion in 1899. This she used to illustrate a poem that she also contributed to that journal. She may have been in New York then, and maybe not, it's not clear. But it is documented that in 1901, she married a man named Herbert Warren West in the Bronx. Marriage did not stifle her artistic aspirations. Here signed HBW. You see now she was Helen Barnhart West. And here's a 1906 gouache, black, white, and gray on cardboard that apparently was intended to be one of a series of fours, an illustration for a macabre Santa Claus story. Apparently those never appeared. 1909, Helen believed that the depiction of children was a milestone in the history of art, and she was a master at depicting children. Here's an early watercolor, you see 1909, a couple of girls playing cards. This was not eating her hand of cards, but a sandwich rather, and watching. She, by 1910, was separated from West, still married, she living in a boarding house in Manhattan, he with his sister across the river. By the winter of 1911 or 12, she made an appearance at a very unusual school in New York City. It was called the Ferrer Center and Modern School. It had sprung up a little before that date in sympathy to the 1909 execution of Francisco Ferrer, who was a career anarchist in Spain. The school attracted lots of prominent radicals, like Will Durant and his 15-year-old bride, Ida Kaufman, Margaret Sanger, the Planned Parenthood foundress, was prominent around the center, and others. I'm not sure exactly what attracted Helen there, maybe not politics at that date, but there was a feature that would have for sure, and that was very cheap. Art instruction from masters like Robert Henry and his pupil George Bellows. Among Helen's classmates were Rockwell Kent, a prominent graphic artist, Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, paused in Chicago for a little while, and also Emanuel Rabinowitz, whom you might recognize as Man Ray. Helen's art persisted, and this was a cover she did for the Modern School magazine, and though, as it says, winter number 1912-1913. Probably the most significant thing that occurred to her at her time at the school was meeting a young man named Roger Paul Heller, 16 years younger than she, a recent honors graduate from Lehigh University in electrical engineering, who had come to the big city with all kinds of glowing predictions for professional success, and had lost not one, not two, but 3 jobs in rapid succession. 16 years younger than she. He appeared at the Ferrer Center, probably being an idealist and a reformer and a big fan of the synthetic language Esperanto, which was taught at the school. Those are the things that probably drew him. At any rate, they became a couple. She was still attached to West legally. And in probably late 1913, they left New York for Allentown, Pennsylvania, where they soon made national news, at least as far as the Washington Post, where it was reported that the two had been preaching socialism and free love, and then in 1914 were arrested for boarding house theft. A watch was in question, and I think probably the affair was choreographed by his parents to dissolve the union between their young son and an older woman of dubious and shadowy repute, I'm sure, in their opinion. But what makes me think it was probably a bit of a sham was that while she was put in jail, he was consigned to a mental hospital, where they remained until they promised to separate. Well, but one couldn't depend upon the anarchists for honesty, I guess, because as soon as they were free, they made a beeline to the Lehigh County Courthouse, where they pointed out to the county clerk that Pennsylvania law permitted them to wed themselves without benefit of any sort of ceremony. He looked it up, and sure enough, they were legally married. While all this was going on, Helen remained active again, at least with drawing. See now how her drawing has changed in a few years. She gets a marvelous impression with many fewer lines. And as I promised you, she was always especially adept at depicting children. Not quite consistent with the image of an anarchist, maybe, but then her politics never did intrude too much into her art. Here's another one that she dated, in fact, called Hungarian Child in Pennsylvania, 1913. You know, wonderful charcoal drawing. And this, one of my favorites. Now, I'll see if I can. I liked it so much I use it on the cover of this book that compiles all of her poetry. She was especially adept with ink, brush, and pen. And this has the added feature of being signed with both her names. She was first Helen West, you see, and then later inscribed as Helen West Heller. Once they left, they had a short, once they left Allentown, they had a short celebration at the socialist headquarters, and she took him in tow back to the family farm in Illinois, where again, marriage did not stifle her art. She illustrated 3 small books of poetry, 2 of which are on display here. And for this work, she did very fine line watercolor illustrating, which she said she used magnifying glasses to get these details. Now, I think this small work probably abetted her later career as a woodcut artist. She also became a published poet. 6 or 7 poems she published during those years, and I'm sure this one is autobiographical. The 2 of them don't make a farmer. I have to feel that this is young husband Roger trying to learn how to be a farmer from her father. And all the rest of this goes with our impressions of them over those years. The young man knows all the theory, she said. She did not mean any kind of agricultural theory. He told her, and she reported by letter to friends back at the Ferrer School in New York City, that Roger was engaged in attempting to develop a notation that would represent all the sounds of all the Aryan languages. She told a reporter one time that her husband could be found running around with pockets full of organ reeds, trying to emulate the sounds of nature. She also wrote that in those days she was cruelly overworked. It was clear that in helping her father, she was bearing the brunt of the labor, to the point that she was once admitted to hospital and that her heart stopped beating for a time. So after 7 years of this, she presented her husband with an ultimatum. Develop your research into something remunerative, or I shall go my own way. Now, he demurred, and she lived up to her vow. So in November of 1921, accompanied with about 50 small paintings, she headed again for Chicago. Her immediate objection was an exhibition at the Art Institute there. But unfortunately, all of her would-be contributions were rejected. And so were those of a lot of other aspiring artists. So she was invited to exhibit in their Salon des Refus, which they had organized, much in the fashion of their Parisian predecessors, and became rather a fixture in the art world of Chicago. She had her first show there in March of 1922 at a Walden bookshop in the Loop, and sold one or two paintings, depending upon which of her sentences we choose to believe. One of her art compatriots of the time published this cartoon in which he satirized all of his contemporary artists in Chicago at the time. And here is his vision of Helen West Heller, a frail woman, angry, with a bomb ignited and in her hand. He even fudged a little bit with her first name to get two Hells in her name, Helen West Heller, except maybe he was a little more accurate than he thought, because census records show that that is in fact the way she was christened, with two L's. In 1923, a fortuitous thing occurred, maybe because of his relative cheapness. She began woodcutting. She said in 1923 she did her first real woodcut. So we can see a couple of them from those days. The first, here's the title piece for this exhibition. As was already told you, she was a chum of Birger Sandzen for a time, and this is in fact inscribed to him. This is the one on exhibit here, and she did this in 1926 and called it Prairie Child. There's no doubt that she saw herself as the prairie child in this way, dancing under the stars in an unrestrained fashion. We also have here an early example of her beginning to use geometric patterns to enhance her work. As time went by, this became more and more a signature aspect of her art. So she sold some paintings. She had many shows in Chicago, but she was not getting much in the way of reward. And perhaps it was that she was somewhat in advance of her public, maybe beyond the leading edge as they saw it in Chicago at the time. She was a woman, she was a modernist. Those were two strikes in that place at that time. And again, she had a tendency to represent things in unorthodox ways. You have to brace yourself a bit before I show you the next picture, because this was said by a lady critic at the time to inspire in her repugnant fright. Helen called this creation. And here we see woman being created. Probably, well, definitely not in along the biblical theory of woman's creation. And exactly the process is impossible to discern. But as in a lot of her work, questions are evoked. One thing you should notice when you walk through and look at the pictures are expressions on faces. Sometimes it's hard to discover what is running through her subjects' minds. The creator in this case, with his Leonardo-type smile, perhaps he is perpetrating a prank on woman, or perhaps he thinks he's perpetrating a prank on man. It's difficult to say. She did this also in Bethany's collection and displayed back here. She called Interruption. Very much looks like a Japanese woodblock printing in delicacy of colors and flowing lines. And despite the relative success of this print, she abandoned color prints for close on to 30 years, or at least 25 years. And that was always a puzzle to me, because critics always admired her coloration in her paintings. But perhaps because if you remember the technique here, for the color woodblock print, one has to cut a block for each color and be particularly careful then about orienting the page correctly for the successive impressions that are necessary. In those days too, she revived her poetic pen and for nearly 2 years, from 1925 to 1927, had a weekly poem in the Chicago Evening Post. She had, in fact, her own column, which was called Tanka, T-A-N-K-A, which is a Japanese form of poetry. With these few lines each week, she propagated her views of herself, information about her past. She wrote about the business of art, particular artists that she admired, street scenes in Chicago, the contemporary culture, life, aging, death. And you can, when you check this, the words here, as you probably already have, you'll see that this is not very encouraging, but probably was her life at the time. And here you see a woodcut that she made then to accompany this later, not in the newspaper, of her bowl and single spoon and a book to boot. Because in 1928 she did a significant thing. She created the first all woodcut book that had text. There had previously been books, woodcut books, lacking words, pictures only. But Helen incorporated a lot of her previously published poems in this book, which she called Migratory Urge, and incised the letters even into the block too, so that they showed up in white. 109 copies of this book were published. She autographed them all, numbered them. They all sold apparently, but this still was not enough to give her much of a life. As an example of her instability in those days, in 11 years in Chicago, she had 9 different addresses. So in the autumn of in February, in fact, of 1932, she pulled up stakes for her final migration, this to New York City again. One might say she got off to a flying stop because it was not long before she wrote back to a columnist acquaintance in Chicago that the great advantage of New York City over Chicago was that there were many more galleries in which one's work could be rejected. And that this lessened the possibility of dying on the streets, that one might die in a gallery instead. So, we hear of Kander and Ebb's song, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. So I guess according to, income, Helen did not make it. She didn't live comfortably, a 2-room coal flat eventually. But she made it in terms of art, because it really then began to burgeon like wildflowers after a spring shower. She was always wonderful at physical likenesses. I think she could have been a great portraitess if she had desired. But she stuck to what she wanted to do, and that is why I call my biography of her and of Roger Uncompromising Souls. They were both uncompromising souls, and therefore that would not promise to be a great marriage in the first place, would it? A favorite of mine is this she called Flight, where she really reached a peak insofar as the geometric repetitious patterns now figures emerge from them. And as usual with all her work, check this when you look at her pictures, they always inspire a lot of questions. Who is helping whom? Is this deterring the figure or helping it? And so forth and so forth. This appeared in the 40s, or I think 1950 in fact, in the communist magazine, Masses and Mainstream. What is this creature, this apparent designer? This was untitled, by the way, but you see the great columns and their capitals here and arches. The oval here is reminiscent of an ellipse, so perhaps it's planetary motion being designed. Who knows? But just a wonderful array of the patterns that together make up a fine picture. We'll skip that one. Yes. In 1934, she met a very colorful woman named Anya Latour in New York City. Anya was a friend of many artists, eventually had a gallery, eventually opened a museum of modern art in Indiana. Helen was one of her favorites. She got lots of praise in Anya's journals, which were prolific. And this one was done soon after they met in 1934 by a chum, an artist chum of Anya's named Philip Ayer Sawyer. Here she would have been, this is the year when she turned 62. And he's got kind of a mischievous look about her, and I think was probably flattered by the drawing. The next year, in 1935, she met another woman that was important to her life. When she married, she became Helen Garlinghouse. Helen Garlinghouse, who for 20 years was the artist's chief support. So far as everyday items of comfort like radios, Helen did never even have a telephone. Helen Garlinghouse would bring her radios, invite her to her home, arrange shows for her, sell her pictures in a home gallery that the Garlinghouse woman operated, and generally be a friend. When this Helen married in 1949, then she became Garlinghouse. In 1950, their son Kent was born, and it's Kent Garlinghouse who has contributed many of the fine pictures you're to see in this exhibition. Probably around 1937, this picture was taken. Here's the artist at work on probably her biggest project for the Federal Arts Program, which was part of the WPA. For about 6 years, she was paid by the WPA around $60 a month, about $90 a month, as I recall, to do art for public consumption. This was a kind of welfare where something had to be shown in return for what one was given. And she did some wonderful woodcuts that are now in the Newark, New Jersey Public Library. But the biggest thing she did was a mural for the Neponset Beach Hospital in Queens, New York, for the children's ward. This was not a mural in the classical sense. Helen envisioned this as working best as a collection of panels. And here she is at work on one. Again, we see she's left-handed, that's for sure. And these are very colorful on egg tempera, paint on canvas, almost to the extent of looking like cartoons, but after all, they were meant for the children's ward. Between this and 2 years later, when the mural reception was held, you see she had aged considerably, very frail. Here she is speaking to one of the patients in the hospital with a couple of her panels as background. Here's another picture of the reception, and I included this so one can appreciate what a small, frail woman this fire plug really was. And here, arranged in rather a frieze way around the tops of the walls, are the constituents of her mural. Later in life, some rewards came her way. The Library of Congress annual print shows were very prestigious affairs. And to win something there, one had to pass 2 juries, a jury for admission and a jury for prizes. So she had a 3rd in 44, as I show, and a 1st in 47 and 49. We already know that she was elected to the National Academy in 48, and her second book, Woodcuts USA, came out in 47. A copy of this is displayed in the exhibition room. In 49, the Smithsonian gave her a special exposition, and she returned to the wonderful colored prints, again thanks to Mr. Garlinghouse, who had several of these. Between 50 and 52, she created a lot of them according to her, these were successful and sold, whereas I've only been able to find them in the Library of Congress and in Mr. Garlinghouse's collection. Who's Who was a little more prestigious in those days than it is today, but she made that. And unfortunately, the last 2 years of her life were not pleasant. Her attempts at writing biographical letters literally dripped with venom. She was living on welfare from Artists' Equity in New York City, and even people that had been helpful to her in her career came in for some slashes and stabs. But I think an elderly woman now who had followed a particular path all of her life, succeeded extremely well, but yet never been rewarded, she deserved perhaps to be a little bit bitter. This is when she fell ill, 9th of November, 55. 10 days later, she died alone at Bellevue Hospital, and then subsequently was buried by charity across the river in Linden, New Jersey. At least she has a headstone in plot number 100 in Rose Hill Cemetery. For a couple of years before her passing, she wrote to several friends how she was engaged in a large project of completing 6 sets of all her woodcuts and six catalogs to accompany them, and that she had all the wood blocks in her apartment. These never surfaced. There are some letters that suggest they might have been used as kindling for the furnaces in the apartment building where she lived. And there are also notes in Mrs. Garlinghouse's papers that suggest the police removed things from her apartment at the time of her death. And my efforts to get some comments out of them, whether those might be stored somewhere, have been unsuccessful. Roger was contacted, set out for New York City, but was soon listed as missing. He did arrive after her burial sometime in New York City. He had told friends there wasn't really any hurry for someone that was already dead, so he would stop and see a few museums on the way. He was still around in New York City in September of 1959 when he was arrested for the things that had only gotten him winks back in Canton, Illinois, like sleeping on the pavement and piling up trash. He was shipped off, in this case, to Bellevue Hospital for observation, which resulted in the decree, certainly incorrect, that he was a threat to himself and to others. So poor Roger spent the last 16 years of his life in mental institutions on Long Island. Well, still at the time of his death, he was able to write very articulate letters. So these are the 2 uncompromising souls that have attracted my attention. And I think this Dizzy Dean said about pitching, he may not have been the greatest, but he was amongst them. And I think Helen could have said that about being a woodcut artist. Many people thought she was the finest woodcut artist America ever produced. If not, she certainly was amongst those, as well as amongst the best in the world. So I hope you enjoy the exhibition, and I'm very grateful for the gallery here, and Ron and Corey for staging it, and to have been invited. Thanks very much.
Anybody have quick questions for Larry before we head over and check out Gordon's show?